Welcome back, everyone. With all the recent talk about bots on the site chess.com, ChatGPT, etc., I thought we would take a trip down memory lane and take a look at a famous game that was played between a former world chess champion and one of the best chess programs at the time in the year 2006. Now, before we dive into the game, I want to give you guys a little bit of a history lesson on this. The first computers that ever played against the best humans in the world started in 1996 when there was a match played between the world champion Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue. Now, in that match in 1996, Garry Kasparov won very convincingly by a score of 4-2. In 1997, in the rematch, Deep Blue won by a score of 3.5, 2.5. It won the very controversial sixth and final game. There was also Garry accusing the programmers of having cheated in one of the earlier games, so I might review that game down the road. At any rate, Deep Blue did beat Garry in 1997. Now everything continued onwards. That was not the end of the discussion as far as whether computers were clearly superior to humans at the time. In 2003, Garry Kasparov once again played against Deep Jr., and the score was 3-3 in a 6-game match. In 2005, a top 10 player, Michael Adams from the United Kingdom, he also played a match against the computer program Hydra, as we say in the Marvelverse, Hail Hydra, as Captain America would say. At any rate, in 2006, there was also a very important match that was somewhat overlooked between the world champion at the time, Vladimir Kramnik, and the program Deep Fritz. Now, they also played a 6-game match. Deep Fritz would win the match convincingly, and with that would sort of bring to an end the era of the best humans against computers. After that, we sort of admitted that we just simply were not as good. Anyway, we're going to take a look at one of the very specific games from this match between Deep Fritz and Vladimir Kramnik. Kramnik playing with the black pieces against Deep Fritz. The game starts with D4. Additionally, to give you guys some other background, Fritz, the program, it's a German-based program made by the same programmers, I believe, who made Chess-Based. And it was the first program that I ever used when I was 9 years old. The program that I was using was Fritz 4. Now, Fritz obviously improved. Nowadays, there are many more versions. I think there's like Fritz 15, 14, 15, 16, somewhere around there. But it is the program that I initially used. So for those of you guys who all you hear about are programs like Ribka, Stockfish, etc., there were programs that were the OGs at the time. Anyway, the game starts with D4. We get D5 from Kramnik. We get C4 being played here. And now we get D takes C4, E4, and Kramnik plays B5. Now, this shows some really good understanding because one of the fascinating variations that is played in the Queen's Gambit Accepted is this line with A4, C6, as happens in the game, where White actually plays this move. A takes B5, C takes B5, Knight to C3. Now, in this position, Black can actually play this move A6, and after Knight takes B5, A takes B5, Rook takes A8, Bishop B7, Rook to A1, and E6. This is a very topical theoretical line that is played quite frequently in modern day chess. Now, this is a game all the way back in 2006, so it's pretty impressive that Kramnik offers to go into one of these variations. So after C6, we get the move Knight to C3 being played here by Deep Fritz. Now we get B4 and Knight to A2 is played. Now again, after Knight to C3, Black has options. B4 is an option. You can maybe play A6 as well. You can also play E6 potentially, or even Knight to F6. This way, if White trades on B5 and tries to win back his pawn, Black gets a pawn on E4. So in this position, Kramnik plays B4, and we get this move Knight to A2 being played by Deep Fritz. Kramnik temporarily up a pawn here, but both of these pawns are under attack. We get this move Knight to F6. E5 is played, so White is no longer hanging the pawn on E4. And now after the move Knight to D5, we get Bishop takes C4 being played by Deep Fritz. After Bishop takes C4, Kramnik plays E6 so that he can now develop this dark square bishop. Additionally, you can put the light square bishop on B7 or A6, so you're not super concerned about closing this diagonal. We get Knight to F3, and Kramnik plays A5. Now we get Bishop G5, and he goes Queen B6. Now you could play Bishop E7 here, but I suspect the reason Kramnik did not do this is he's worried that after trading the dark square bishops, White can reroute this knight to either D3 or B3 and go for the C5 square. Say Black castles, for example, White can play something like Knight B3. If you play a move like Bishop B7, White goes Knight C5, and now this bishop is misplaced, and after a move like Rook A7, White can even potentially go Knight E4, trying to go after this D6 square as well. So the dark squares are definitely a weakness. Therefore, Kramnik plays Queen B6. Knight C1 is played anyway by Deep Fritz. We get Bishop to A6. Queen to E2 is played. Kramnik plays H6, just asking Deep Fritz, where is the dark square bishop going? Because ideally here you would love to develop the bishop to E7, but as I mentioned, if you play Bishop E7, White will simply trade the bishops, and you will have these weaknesses on the D6 and C5 squares. So he goes h6, we get bishop e3. If you go bishop h4 here, black is actually winning the game because of this knight f4 move, attacking the queen on e2. If white plays queen to f1, retreating the queen, you can trade the bishops and win the pawn on g2, and white has to move the king, and after takes knight a6, followed by rook to d8, or even knight to c7 and d5. Frankly, black is simply doing very, very well here. So you can't really move the bishop back to h4, so you go bishop e3, and now Kramnik trades and goes knight d7, knight to b3 here, stopping this pawn push, and now he plays bishop to e7. Now Kramnik, of course, waiting quite a bit before developing the dark square bishop, but it doesn't really matter because the position is very, very stable here. He has this one weakness on c6, but he can play rook c8, and white's not really ever attacking on the king side or in the center of the board, so therefore there's no big rush. So now we get rook c1, Kramnik castles here, and now Deep Fritz castles. Now you may be wondering on first glance, well, that looks like a free pawn, right? You have a queen, you have a rook, you're doing very, very well here. But if you play queen takes c6 in this specific position, black can actually trade the queens on c6 and now play knight 7 to b6 because the a4 pawn cannot be defended. And after you move the king, let's just say castles, knight takes a4, black has a 2-on-1 on the queen side here. The extra pawn in the center on d4 is blockaded by this knight on d5, so black is doing very, very well. So in this position, Deep Fritz castles, and now we get rook f c8 played by Kramnik. The idea is pretty simple here. White wants to try and put pressure on the pawn in a5, prevent this pawn push, and then maybe gang up on the c6 pawn and try to win it down the road. Deep Fritz plays queen to e2. We get c5 here. Now queen e2 is an interesting move because white could play rook c2 with rook c1 ideas, and after rook c7, rook c1, rook a c8, white probably can still play a move like queen d3 here with the rooks perfectly placed. Again, I'm not a computer, so I don't know the reasoning behind this, but Deep Fritz was not interested. Instead, it plays the move queen to e2, c5, and now it plays this move knight fd2. Now this is another idea that white can go for, which is to try and put a knight on d2 and then go to either c4 or e4. But again, if black can play c5 and get rid of this one weakness, black should be okay. So after c5, we get knight fd2 being played here by Deep Fritz, and Kramnik plays queen c6. Idea is very simple. He doesn't really want to take on d4 because after bishop takes d4, queen to b7, white will play g3, stopping knight f4 to illustrate why. If you play a move like, I don't know, let's just say rook to c4, for example, black can go knight f4 here, and you're forking the queen and the pawn. You're also threatening checkmate in one, and white has some issues to deal with. So after g3 stopping knight f4, let's just say I play rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and a move like bishop f8. The problem with this position is that you have this permanent weakness on a5, and white can go knight c4 to try and win it with both of these knights placed on the c4 and b3 squares, and black is in some trouble. So that's what white is playing for here, is basically he's hoping that he can put pressure on his pawn at a5. So we get queen c6 here, and now queen to h5 is played. Now this is a very strange move. It's interesting too because as I'm looking at this game, you'll notice that the modern day engines do not like the way that Deep Fritz has played this game. It actually gives Kramnik a significant advantage here. Now the modern day stockfish likes moves like knight takes c5, but it does think that after knight takes, queen takes, knight takes c5, and this weird move b3, that black is probably completely fine after a move like queen d5, pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight, queen to e2, and then a move like rook d8, simply because black is a very powerful dark square bishop. He controls the d file, at least at the moment, and white really doesn't have a whole lot going on. You also have a weak pawn on e5 as well. So modern day computers don't actually like the way that Deep Fritz was playing. So it goes queen to h5. Now Kramnik takes on a4, and we get this move knight takes c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5. And here Kramnik plays a very interesting move. He plays this move knight takes e3, removing the bishop on e3. Now if you think about this position conceptually, there are a couple of things. First of all, white has this pass pawn, potentially weak pawn on c5. At the same time, there aren't really big threats on the king side. So like if you just play a move like not queen c6, but a move like queen b5, for example, is bishop takes h6 really a big deal? Not really, because after takes, queen takes h6, you can simply go bishop f8 and bishop g7, or even queen to d3 with the idea of going queen g6 to offer the queen trade. So it's not really a big deal in terms of the queen being on h5, but Kramnik decides to take on e3 here to avoid anything happening whatsoever. However, the issue with taking the bishop on e3 is now once white takes on e3 with the pawn, the f file opens up, and even though white has a double stack, there are some big threats going towards his pawn at f7. Now here Kramnik plays bishop takes c5, queen takes f7 played by Deep Fritz, and now we get the move king h8, and here queen to f3 is played by Deep Fritz. Now at this point, Kramnik is doing very, very well. He has a 2-on-1 majority on the queen side in an endgame that should be good. White has double stacked pawns on e3 and e5. They're actually quite weak too, because you have this very nice dark square bishop. So black is a majority, better bishop, even material, and a better pawn structure. Just overall, what can possibly go wrong? Surely Kramnik's going to win this game, right? Well, not so fast. Kramnik plays rook f8, queen to e4 is played. We get queen to d7, retreating the queen and attacking the knight. Knight to b3 is played here by Deep Fritz. Now Kramnik correctly puts the bishop on b6. You do not put the bishop on e7 here, because the bishop on e7 is simply staring at diagonals with nothing on them whatsoever. But by going to b6, you guard the pawn on a5, but you also keep an eye on the pawn on e3 here. So now we get rook fd1 being played, and queen to f7 is played by Kramnik, trying to take advantage of having the queen and the rook stacked on the f file. And again, really nice position. Deep Fritz plays rook f1, Kramnik goes queen to a7 here, lining up a threat towards his pawn on e3. We get rook takes rook, and now knight to d4 is played by Deep Fritz. Now everything is going really well here for Kramnik. He's got everything he wants. He has a 2 versus 1 on the queen side. He's got a better bishop than knight, bad pawn structure. He's going to win the game. So Kramnik plays a4, which is a pretty good move. We get knight takes pawn here, and now Kramnik takes on e3, and we get this move king h1. And now black actually has to think a little bit, because the problem with taking this rook on c1 is now your rook hangs on f8, and there are some problems on some of the light squares around your king potentially. But if you play rook to e8 here, for example, which is another move, you do start to get a little bit scared of moves like rook to c7, attacking the queen, because if you play queen b6 after rook takes g7, you're simply getting mated on h7 next move. So you do have to be careful. And again, when you're playing against a computer which you know is not going to make severe blunders, you kind of hesitate and second guess yourself quite frequently. So Kramnik here decides to capture the rook instead. We get this move knight takes f8. Now bishop takes c1 is a fairly serious blunder here, because as you can see from the evaluation bar, it gives this position as equal. As I said before, after rook to e8, if white goes rook c7, you can play queen to a6 here, which actually is winning, because you have queen f1 creating the classic back rank checkmate. But Kramnik takes, we get knight takes f8, and here Kramnik uses some time and plays this very interesting move, queen to e3. Now the idea behind queen e3 is quite simple. If white plays a move like queen c4, you get queen e1, leading to the classic back rank checkmate. So white doesn't have a whole lot. If you play queen takes b4, black goes bishop d2 here, threatening to make the checkmate on e1. And after white plays queen to h4 here, black has this very nice geometrical solution with bishop b4 attacking the knight. Now the reason this move is so nice is that what it does is e1 is covered by the queen on h4, but when you play bishop b4 here, you'll now notice you're attacking the knight, but you're also threatening to checkmate with queen c1. So by moving the bishop, you target the knight, you free the d2 square so the queen can go to c1, and this is simply winning. White can play knight g6, king h7, and then h3, for example. If you take the knight, white takes the bishop and he's fine, but you do have bishop to c5 here, threatening to make the checkmate on g1 with the queen and the bishop, and the game would be over. So after bishop to b4, knight g6, king h7, h3, bishop c5, you're threatening mate. White can move the king, but you just take the knight even, and you're completely winning. So Kramnik's idea is very good here, because he figures, well, if queens come off the board, I'm just winning, because after knight d7, a3, my pawn is just way too fast. You can't go to c5 and b3. The bishop on e3 covers the square. You make a queen, you win the game. It's all good. You're going to beat the computer, right? There's only one problem, which is that when you play queen to e3, this hangs the very unfortunate move queen to h7, which is checkmate, which was played on the board. So this is hugely shocking to see a world champion do this. Of course, it almost never happens. In Blitz it'll happen, but in a slow classical game of chess, you almost never see a mate in one hung by a grandmaster, let alone the world champion. Now it's very unfortunate, because if Kramnik had won this game, the match could have been entirely different. And if Kramnik wins this game, he probably doesn't lose the match, and this would have led to many more human versus computer matches. But after Kramnik lost this match 4-2 in 2006, it really heralded the end of the human versus computer discussion, and we never saw any more major matches after this. So Kramnik is to blame for letting humanity down. At any rate, you guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've not hit the subscribe button below already, make sure that you hit it, and we will be back with more great YouTube content in the very near future. See you guys soon. Bye.